I love monsters. But no, not the imaginary frightening creature, rather the caffeinated beverage. While breathing fire and having spikes down your back is pretty cool, personally, I prefer the general rush I get after I consume the caffeine. But when I tell people this fact about myself, they automatically assume that I have an addiction, and that's incorrect. There is no chemical dependency in my brain on caffeine, and personally, I don't feel like I need caffeine in order to be myself. Addictions are a complicated and intricate working of the brain, and the general belief that anybody who uses or has used an addictive substance is automatically addicted is incorrect. So today, let's take a look into the mind of addiction by first introducing the neurobiological aspects, then moving on to the difference between chemical, emotional, and behavioral dependencies, and by finally exploring some addictions that are plaguing society today. But first, did you know that only around 20 to 30% of people who use addictive substances actually develop an addiction? Yes, you heard me right. It seems like it should be a much larger number, doesn't it? Drug addiction, or chronically relapsing disorder, is defined by 3 different stages: binge, craving, and withdrawal. Those 3 different stages are a result from abnormal functioning in 3 different parts of the brain: the amygdalostridium, or the impulsive system, the prefrontal cortex, or the executive system, and the insula, or the craving system. Now, this may all seem like a foreign language to you, but in reality, there's one quite common and simple factor that goes along with addictions. Dopamine, or more commonly known as the happy hormone, is a neurotransmitter that acts as a messenger between neurons. It's naturally produced during activities that bring a sense of pleasure or reward, and these activities can include anything from swimming, dancing, eating, drinking, or just hanging out with your friends. But unhealthy activities and substances like heroin and cocaine release massive amounts of dopamine. And those massive amounts of dopamine then in turn can't be reabsorbed back into the brain. This is what gives people that euphoric high. In excess, this is the possibility to alter the brain's chemistry to where normal activities don't produce as much dopamine as they used to. And this leads people to go out and search for those same drugs that gave them that euphoria and contained those analgesic properties, or in other words, the property to take away the feeling of pain. Now, this eventually becomes a goal-directed behavior, or cause and effect, if you will. Cause being the finding and taking of the drug, and the effect being the literal physical high. This could also be known as a form of associative learning. The brain becomes reprogrammed in a sense to associate the high from the drugs with that same feeling of pleasure or reward, and eventually, the same activities that previously produced dopamine are eventually just forgotten. But chemical addictions aren't the only type of addictions that can use associative learning. There's actually 3 different types of addictions that use associative learning: chemical, emotional, and behavioral. According to the American Addiction Centers, a chemical addiction takes place when the body's cells can't properly function without a specific drug or substance. A common example for a chemical addiction is caffeine. Caffeine is most commonly used for the stimulation that it gives you, as a wake-up call, you could say. But like any other addictive substance, a tolerance can be built up against those wake-up properties, and over time, the user would need to increase the amount of caffeine that they consume. Now, emotional addictions are on the complete other side of the spectrum. They're defined as the perceived need to continue a certain act that creates a specific emotion. The 7 Pathways Treatment and Recovery Center defines emotional addictions as somebody with an emotional addiction can become dependent on a certain emotion for comfort, relief, distraction, or escape. The obsession grows into an obsession, a compulsion, and an addiction. And they later went on to explain that because emotions are a primitive instinct or an immediate response, they're able to bypass any sort of use of logic, which leads people to disregard consequences. A common example for an emotional addiction is fear. Somebody addicted to the feeling or response of fear could turn to possibly illegal or harmful substances in order to spark that feeling of fear. Now, a common subset of a fear addiction is adrenaline-induced fear. Somebody that had an adrenaline-induced or adrenaline fear emotional addiction could turn to things like skydiving or bungee jumping, or just sort of doing anything that gives you that thrill of life. Now, this can become confused with behavioral addictions, but there's one small yet prominent difference. Behavioral addictions stem from a physical act, and not the acts that create the emotion. A common example for behavioral addiction is technology. Somebody addicted to technology could turn to technology for that fulfillment of stimulation, to occupy their brain. According to the Hazelton Betty Ford Foundation, a rehabilitation center for addicts, Technology has the same effects on the pleasure system of the brain that drugs do, and because of this, technology addictions are incredibly easy to come by. Now that we've gone over the difference between chemical, emotional, and behavioral dependencies, let's explore some addictions that are plaguing society today. Many more addictive substances and tendencies are becoming more normalized and less stigmatized. I mean, caffeine addictions have been popular for years in the past, but with the newfound popularity of energy drinks, such as Monster, Red Bull, Bang, etc., caffeine addictions are becoming more normalized for teenagers and young children. And taking an in-depth look, it can also be found that things like vaping and alcohol abuse are substances becoming more and more normalized, and especially for young teenagers. Now, to the abuser, this newly found normative wouldn't necessarily seem troubling. But from an outside perspective, this event is worrisome to say the least. But not only are chemical addictions on the rise, behavioral addictions are making a breakthrough as well. A common example for behavioral addiction is marijuana. Now, technically, marijuana has no chemically addictive properties, but somebody could possibly become addicted to that euphoria and the high that it gives you. But one of the most common and prevalent sources of behavioral addictions today is social media. With the ever-evolving technology and the ever-updating social media platforms, social media addictions are becoming more prevalent and more problematic. But where the real issue arises is with the negative impacts it can have on one's mental health. Think about it. Teenagers, young adults, and even children are spending their days on apps like TikTok and Instagram, where they're constantly seeing and watching people that they envy. And this in turn can bring down their self-esteem, how they interact with their environment, or how they interact with other people. Now refer back to that same study done by the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. Harvard University did a similar study to where they found that social media can have the same effects on the pleasure system of the brain that drugs do as well. And because of this, social media addictions can become incredibly common and incredibly harmful. Throughout the years, we've seen many contributors to the rise or the spike in the number of addicts. The nicotine business, which was slowly and surely being killed out until somebody decided to make it flavored. The narcotics organizations, the alcohol companies, and etc., etc. But in the recent times of COVID-19 and quarantine, we've seen a major spike in the number of addicts. And this was caused from the isolation that quarantine caused, which made people want to seek out those addictive substances to possibly fill that void of loneliness. According to the Center for Disease Control, around 13% of Americans reported seeking out or increasing their substance use in order to cope with the stress or emotions that COVID-19 had caused. But COVID-19 isn't the only cause for the rise of addictions. Societal pressures to be cool aid in that ever-growing normalization. I mean, I'm sure we've all experienced it in some way, shape, or form. Pressures to smoke a joint, take a shot, vape, or do pretty much anything deemed cool aid in the ever-growing normalization. But where the real issue arises is with the stigma. What people fail to realize is that viewing addicts as weak isn't necessarily going to help them. The set societal views is that they got themselves into this mess and they should be looked down upon for it. But it's not always the intent to become addicted. In 2017, it was recorded that around 1.7 million Americans suffered from a substance abuse disorder related to painkillers. Yes, that's right, the prescribed medication created to aid in the recovery process. And opioid addicts are bashed for their dependence on medication. Yet people addicted to caffeine are notably viewed with more respect and less pity. Like, personally, I can attest to this. I have never been bashed for having a caffeine I don't have a caffeine addiction, promise. Anyways, so let's really stop and think about it. Who's to blame for this ever-growing normalization? Is it the addicts in general? Is it the people who pressure others? Or is it really just the preconceived ideas that are surrounding addiction? After all, isn't everybody addicted in some form? Thank you.